Charlize Theron spent 5 years building one of Netflix's most compelling action franchises, delivered a masterclass in playing an immortal warrior grappling with newfound mortality. And then The Old Guard 2 arrived with Uma Thurman as a villain who gets less screen time than most guest stars on procedural TV shows. But the real tragedy isn't the wasted casting. It's how the sequel fundamentally misunderstands what made Andy and Nile's relationship the heart of the original film. Today, I'm breaking down why The Old Guard 2's treatment of its lead characters represents both the franchise's greatest strength and its most frustrating weakness. The burden of mortality that nobody seems to care about. The Old Guard 2 opened 6 months after Andy lost her immortality, and this should be the driving force behind every scene. When you've lived for thousands of years and suddenly face the possibility of permanent death, every mission becomes a potential suicide run. The film occasionally acknowledges this reality. Andy wears a bulletproof vest now. Her team shows protective concern, but it never truly explores the psychological weight of her transformation. Charlize Theron brings the same physical intensity that made the first film work, but she's working with a script that treats Andy's mortality more like a plot device than a character-defining crisis. The original film understood that immortality was both a gift and a curse. Andy carried the weight of centuries, watching civilizations rise and fall, while everyone she loved eventually died around her. Now that she faces the same fate, the sequel should dive deep into that terror and liberation. Instead, we get surface-level moments where Andy looks contemplative, while other characters worry about her safety. The film tells us she's changed, rather than showing us how this fundamental shift has rewired her entire worldview. When you've spent millennia being the indestructible leader, learning to be vulnerable should be seismic, but The Old Guard 2 treats it like a minor inconvenience. Nile's evolution from student to equal. Kiki Lane's Nile Freeman represented the audience's entry point into the first film, a young Marine discovering she couldn't die and learning what that meant from Andy's ancient wisdom. The Old Guard 2 positions Nile as Andy's equal rather than her student, but the film struggles to define what that evolution actually looks like in practice. Lane brings natural charisma and conviction to Nile's expanded role, particularly in scenes where she challenges Andy's decisions or takes independent action. The dynamic between immortal and newly immortal should create fascinating tension as Nile develops her own philosophy about the responsibilities to humanity. She hasn't carried Andy's burden long enough to become cynical, but she's experienced enough loss to understand the cost of their mission. The problem is that the film doesn't give this relationship the space it deserves to breathe and develop. Nile and Andy's best moments come in quiet conversations about purpose and sacrifice, but these scenes feel rushed as the movie hurries towards its next action sequence. Their partnership should be the emotional anchor of the franchise, yet it often feels secondary to plot mechanics and sequel setup. The wasted potential of immortal trauma. Veronica Nyo's Quen represents the film's most compelling concept, an immortal who spent 500 years drowning repeatedly in an iron coffin at the bottom of the ocean. This is psychological horror on an unimaginable scale, the kind of trauma that would fundamentally break anyone's connection to humanity and morality. The setup is brilliant, but the execution falls frustratingly short. Quen's reunion with Andy should be devastating. These were partners for 1,500 years who loved each other before one was condemned to centuries of torture, while the other moved on with her life. The betrayal isn't just personal, it's existential. How do you forgive someone who abandoned you to eternal suffering? How do you trust again when the person you loved most failed to save you? The film hints at this emotional complexity, but never commits to exploring it fully. Quen's anger feels justified, but her alliance with Uma Thurman's discord reduces her to a plot function rather than a traumatized individual seeking her own path to healing or revenge. The movie had the ingredients for a profound meditation on trauma, forgiveness, and the price of immortality, but it settles for surface-level conflict. Uma Thurman's discord, a villain in name only. Casting Uma Thurman as the primary antagonist should have been the Old Guard 2's secret weapon. Thurman brings decades of action credibility and screen presence that could match Charlize Theron beat for beat. Instead, Discord becomes one of Netflix's most underutilized villains, appearing so briefly that audiences barely understand her motivations before the credits roll. The concept behind Discord is sound. She's supposedly one of the oldest immortals who has given up on humanity and wants to end their interference in mortal affairs. This creates an interesting philosophical conflict with Andy's protective instincts, but the film never develops this ideological clash beyond basic exposition. Discord appears in a handful of scenes, delivers ominous warnings, and then vanishes until the climax. Thurman's limited screen time becomes even more frustrating when you realize the film had access to one of cinema's most iconic action stars and chose to sideline her for extended sequences of setup and world building. The few moments where Discord and Andy share the screen crackle with potential, but the movie never capitalizes on the tension between these two forces of nature. The action problem that nobody wants to admit. Victoria Mahoney takes over directing duties from Gina Prince-Bythewood, and while she demonstrates competence with hand-to-hand combat choreography, something essential has been lost in translation. The first film's action felt weighty and consequential because every fight served the character development and plot progression. The sequel's action often feels obligatory, like the movie is checking boxes rather than advancing the story. The opening sequence in Croatia showcases the team's skills, but lacks the emotional investment that made similar scenes in the original feel urgent. When immortal characters can heal from any wound, action scenes need to derive tension from emotional stakes rather than physical danger. Andy's mortality should make every gunfight terrifying, but the film doesn't consistently maintain that sense of vulnerability. The editing becomes choppy during several key action sequences, making it difficult to follow the choreography that was presumably well planned. When you have performers of Theron and Thurman's caliber, the camera should showcase their skills rather than obscuring them with rapid cuts and poor lighting. The technical execution undermines the impressive physical work happening on screen. The sequel setup that kills the story. The Old Guard 2's most damaging flaw is its obsession with franchise building at the expense of narrative completion. The film spends its final act setting up conflicts and revelations that won't be resolved until a potential third installment, leaving audiences with an incomplete story that feels more like an expensive pilot episode than a standalone film. This approach worked for movies like The Empire Strikes Back because they still provided character arcs and emotional resolution within their runtime. The Old Guard 2 literally stops mid-conflict, promising future answers to questions it raised but never addressed. When the credits roll, you feel cheated rather than excited for what comes next. The irony is that the film had all the ingredients for a satisfying conclusion. Andy's mortality, Nile's evolution, Quen's trauma, and Discord's philosophy could have created a complete story about redemption, forgiveness, and finding purpose in an immortal existence. Instead, these elements became chess pieces moved around to create sequel hooks rather than meaningful resolution. Why Charlize and Kiki deserved better. Charlize Theron has proved repeatedly that she can anchor action franchises while bringing dramatic depth to potentially one-dimensional characters. Her work in Mad Max, Fury Road, Atomic Blonde, and the first Old Guard demonstrated how action stars can elevate material through commitment and skill. The Old Guard 2 gives her moments to showcase both sides of her talent, but the incomplete script undermines her efforts. Kiki Lane emerged from the first film as a genuine action star with the range to handle both physical demands and emotional complexity. Her chemistry with Theron suggested a franchise that could explore mentorship, legacy, and the passing of responsibility between generations. The sequel hints at this potential, but never fully commits to developing their relationship. Both actresses deserved a script that honored their characters' journeys while providing a satisfying resolution to the conflicts established in the first film. Instead, they're asked to carry a movie that treats them as stepping stones to future installments rather than the compelling protagonists they've proven themselves to be. The verdict on wasted potential. The Old Guard 2 represents one of the most frustrating sequels in recent memory because it had all the elements necessary for success and chose to squander them. Charlize Theron and Kiki Lane deliver committed performances in service of a story that refuses to commit to its own themes and characters. The film's exploration of mortality, trauma, and purpose touches on profound themes, but never develops them with the depth they deserve. Uma Thurman's casting becomes a missed opportunity rather than a triumph. The action sequences showcase technical competence without emotional investment. Most damaging of all, the Old Guard 2 feels like it's constantly preparing for a future that may never arrive, rather than making the most of the present moment. When your immortal characters feel lifeless, something has gone fundamentally wrong with the storytelling process. So, what's your take? Did the Old Guard 2 waste its incredible cast? Or did you find enough to enjoy despite its flaws? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more analysis of how great concepts can be undermined by poor execution.